Hi guys, Piggy Bank Recaps here. Today I will recap movie called Little Shop of Horror. Spoiler alert. Watch out and take care. At the beginning of the movie we are introduced to a flower shop employee named Seymour. In the shop he has a co-worker named Audrey and a shop owner named Mr Mushnik. Mr. Mushnik treats Audrey very special in contrast to Seymour, who always gets angry because of his carelessness. Besides, it turns out that Mr. Mushnik also has a very high level of emotion. This is because his flower shop has not been visited by buyers in months. The three of them started to get confused because they didn't know what to do in the shop. Because of that, Mr. Mushnik also decided to close his shop from tomorrow until an unknown time. Then at that time Audrey started giving Mr. Mushnik to sell a strange and unique plant that Seymour found in the backyard of the shop. But Mr. Mushnik wasn't sure if his shop would become bustling with selling these strange plants. Even Seymour himself wasn't sure if the plants would attract visitors. But unexpectedly, there was already one visitor who was interested in the plant. Mr. Mushnik was confused and happy because so many visitors suddenly came to his shop. But the three of them have decided not to sell the strange plant. They just use it as an attraction for all visitors to buy another plant. Mr. Mushnik was proud of the idea of the two employees. Then Mr. Mushnik immediately invited them to have dinner together. But at that time Audrey had to refuse his invitation because she already had an appointment with her boyfriend. Then after that Mr. Mushnik also began to tell Seymour that Audrey had been a victim of violence by her boyfriend all this time. Then the dinner was not even held and Mr. Mushnik also said goodbye to return home. Before Mr. Mushnik came home he ordered Seymour to take care of the plant. And at that time Seymour obeyed Mr. Mushnik was because he also had no other consolation other than the strange plant he found. Then suddenly, the plant began to wither, and at that time Seymour also did not know at all why this plant withered in an instant, even though he was very diligent in fertilizing and watering it. Until one day Seymour's finger was hit by a thorn from another plant, and because of that his finger began to bleed. From here Seymour felt something strange with the plant, where the plant began to move suddenly and ordered Seymour to give the blood that was in it, on the finger. And what's even more amazing, the plant also knows which finger is bleeding and which finger is not bleeding. Because there was no other choice, Seymour was forced to start giving his blood to the strange plant. And after the plant got food intake, the strange plant also began to grow, even though Seymour only gave a few drops of its blood. Long story short, because of its size that continues to grow day by day, Seymour was invited by the local radio to explain the plant. But the only thing that was not known by others until now was that the plant always sucks blood from Seymour's finger. Every day Seymour always gave the plant with his own blood. Plus the growth of the plant was so fast that it was now the same height as a teenager. Of course it made local residents very enthusiastic to come to Mr. Flower Shop Mushnik, until Mr. Mushnik himself was overwhelmed to serve him. But at that time Mr. Mushnik didn't seem to care about Seymour at all, even though the sacrifice he had given was very high. Because of this Seymour began to confide in Audrey. At that time they were planning to go out that night. Then there's a man named Oren. He is Audrey's boyfriend who works as a dentist, but Oren has a very strange habit. He always traumatizes his patients to come again. Then in the evening, when Seymour was ready to leave with Audrey, suddenly Oren came to Mr. Flower Shop Mushnik. It is known that all this time Seymour has been living in Mr. Mushnik because he had no family at all in the city. And from here Seymour saw firsthand if Oren always treated Audrey rudely. Seymour also returned to his daily activities, which were none other than spending time with his strange plant. But when Seymour was about to get ready to rest, the plant began to wither again suddenly, and how surprised Seymour was when he heard the plant could talk. At that time the plant again told Seymour to feed it. At that time Seymour tried to refuse it, but the plant still forced Seymour to find food for him. Seymour was starting to get confused because he did not know what to do. Then coincidentally, Seymour saw Oren, who was punishing Audrey to go home on foot. Seymour, who saw that, could no longer contain his emotions, and he immediately arranged a plan to carry out murder. Then Seymour was seen, who came to Oren's practice to pretend to be a patient, but before that Seymour had to wait for one patient who was being treated by Oren. After a long wait, it was now Seymour's turn. Before Oren handled Seymour, he used the gas mask he had just bought while traveling with Audrey. I don't know what the goal was, but at that time Seymour immediately took advantage of these conditions to shoot Oren, but it turned out that Seymour did not dare to kill people, and the mask that Oren used actually killed himself. Then Seymour immediately took Oren's body to the flower shop. Arriving at the flower shop, Seymour also intends to dismember the body. On the other hand, Mr Mushnik was walking towards the house. But just then he heard Seymour's axe swinging, and at that moment Mr Mushnik also saw Seymour dismembering someone's body. Then after everything was done, Seymour immediately gave the body parts to his plants. The next day Seymour began to become worried about his own actions. In addition, Seymour also saw Audrey, who was being approached by two policemen. And it turned out that the two policemen asked Audrey about Oren's disappearance. Hearing this, Seymour also invited Audrey to talk, and at that time Audrey also admitted that she herself couldn't stand Oren's presence anymore, and that's when Seymour began to confess his feelings to Audrey while comforting her. After that Seymour went back to the shop to rest, but he was surprised by the presence of Mr Mushnik was already in his room. And at that time Mr Mushnik also began threatening Seymour to confess to his actions, because Mr Mushnik was the only witness to Seymour's crimes that night. Then Mr Mushnik immediately ordered Seymour to immediately confess to the police. But in an instant Mr Mushnik immediately changed his mind while offering Seymour another solution, that Mr Mushnik would allow Seymour to leave the city on the condition that Mr Mushnik was about to take the plant. But it turned out that Mr Mushnik was not well received by the plant, and the plant also directly ate Mr Mushnik. A few days after the incident, Seymour began to be visited by many TV companies asking for interviews. Plus now the size of the plant is already very large. But suddenly the plant suddenly withered again, and because of it the whole station, the TV, became curious. Then Seymour immediately threw them all away with the excuse that he was going to give medicine to the plants, when in fact Seymour just confused to give food to the plant. Then Seymour had another idea after seeing his girlfriend. At that time he planned to use the money from the TV company and also the magazine to get out of the city. Plus without the plant, of course their life would be calmer. Later that night, Seymour would secretly leave the withered plant, but again Seymour was forced to look for food and could not help but agree with Seymour, but because it was too hasty, Seymour also planned to buy animal meat that has been processed in general. At the same time, Audrey saw the strange plant moving while looking at her, so that it made Audrey curious, and she immediately went to the flower shop. After Audrey arrived at the shop, she was surprised when she heard the plant that could talk to her, but unfortunately the plant actually pulled her body and swallowed her alive instantly. Then suddenly Seymour was back in the shop, and he began to realize that his girlfriend's life was in danger. Seymour tried to expel Audrey, who had been swallowed half the body, although Audrey was successfully expelled by force, but Audrey still had to die because of the poison in the mouth of the plant. Seymour became very stressed because the only woman he loved had died. With a very heavy heart, Seymour immediately made Audrey the last food for the plant. After he finished feeding the plants, Seymour didn't know what to do anymore. So he immediately ran to the roof of the building and planned to kill himself. But at that time he was again surprised by the presence of journalists who were already behind him. And it turns out that a journalist began to admit that he had taken some parts of Seymour's plants and he had also managed to grow a similar plant in his house. A journalist who is already tempted by the money also plans to produce the plant in large quantities, and he will sell the plant to all the people who want to have it. Seymour, who heard this, was very surprised because from this idea the disaster for mankind would be start immediately. Day after day passed. It turned out that the mother of the plant was also getting bigger, and at that time the mother plant was also releasing quite a lot of her children. In the end, Seymour, who took care of the plant, was also eaten alive. Long story short, over time, these plants have been mass-produced and sold to the public even though they all have absolutely no idea how dangerous these plants are to their lives. And after a few days passed, the plague of the giant plant began, wherein life in the city began to crumble in an instant and the movie ended.